All right, in this chapter we'll cover the final rendering of the project and look at how some of these techniques come together to form a final scene. So last time we visited this model was comparing the different fill shadow techniques from dome lights to ambient occlusion. And prior to that we looked at this model for high resolution modeling and looking at bringing in the further developed models over the proxies. What we need to do now is to prepare to do the shading work, and to do that we need to have our lighting roughly in place. First thing we should do is take the model, assign everything to a default blend shader that's nearly white with some specularity so we see where the specular opportunities are in the model, and then adjust our lighting intensity. So if we go to a initial render of this, we can see the basic lighting is in place. We're relying on the 16 source shadow dome just to create the basic fill shadow, and we're looking at a directional light with a noisy fractal added to create a little bit of aberration in the lighting throughout. We also had that increased multiplier on the light. This is all talked about earlier on the disk to get these kind of sizzling highlights on the model. And next, if we look at this over the live action plate, we can see that the lighting feels roughly in place, and this will be fine to proceed from this point. So as far as texturing, I think I'm going to render this with a fairly kind of gleaming glass and metal and concrete appearance. I may not go with some of these peach-colored warm tones, but rather something a little bit contrasting. But I still need to have a little bit of warmth into the city to match into the background plate. So let's look at a few of the textures that I may choose. This is a base concrete texture. And here's the same texture with the reveals painted out in Photoshop, just to provide another option for a less kind of geometric look. So as far as texturing goes, I think I will render this with a lot of glass and concrete, kind of a gleaming look, as opposed to some of the more period warm tones that we get in the other areas of the city. I don't want to make it too diverging though, because I do want to integrate it into the background plate. So I'll probably try to have a little bit of warmth in there. But let's begin to look at some of the textures that will be used. And this is just a baseline concrete texture, cast in place type of appearance. Now, this has nice weathering on it. It's a good kind of workhorse texture, but there will be times when I may want to have this without the reveal lines. So this can be created very easily in Photoshop as a way to eliminate some of the deep reveals. And this can be used in just about any texture. So let's go over to Photoshop very quickly, and I'll show you this technique. Okay, here in Photoshop, the texture's open. And this is a very, very useful little filter. This is under noise, dust, and scratches. And it's a bit of a misnomer because many people think that is what it's used for, and it probably is. But in our case, I found a lot of great creative uses of it. And as you can see, if I set my radius and threshold at a given point, it effectively negates the low values of the image and begins to replace them with an averaged color of gray. So this is a very, very useful, and obviously we can also get a little softer in the texture, and which is actually a very nice use, I'll show this in a moment, is ways to abstract texture maps into something else. So it's a very handy little filter that I've found. Okay, back to the render view, let's look at the next texture in line. And this is one taken from a stock set of architectural maps, and if we use that same filter, we can actually abstract facades into very kind of interesting shapes. So this shape was arrived at purely through the dust and scratch filter, and not consciously designed per se. So I've taken a number of stock facade textures and abstracted them in this way. We also have a specular map for this to create specularity and reflection onto, and we'll show how that's implemented. And this is another abstraction of a stock file. This is moved around with the distort wave command we looked at on the first disk a little bit, and a respective spec map for that. And again, kind of a glass curtain wall abstracted with a dust and scratch filter. And some pretty interesting kind of lines created from it. So you'll see this in the final city. Okay, so moving on now. Now that we have the base shaders, I'm going to need an environment to reflect. And without having any HDR available for the shot, this is again from a stock library. What I can do is go into Photoshop, and we can see the original extents of the plate were about this kind of book matched point, and then coming to here. So from this point, I've now added canvas both to, again, mirror it about itself, book match it, as well as add a grad to a darker color of sky. And this is laid out at a 2K by 1K resolution, actually a 4K by 2K res, and able to give me a reflected environment. And again, it doesn't have to be very accurate. I cloned some of the other city in here very roughly. Again, never be seen this well in reflection, but just to be able to reflect some of the colors of the background plate into the buildings. And in modern architecture, reflection plays in very heavily, so this will be kind of an essential thing in our shaders. All right, let's cut to the chase and look at the final render of the city. So here we have it. We have a lot of concrete surfaces to describe the base of the city, a lot of glass and steel for the actual buildings themselves. And we can also note a lot of reflection mapping from the environment that was created in the last section. Let's look at this at 2K res. And we can see some of the warm tones from the background plate expressed onto the buildings. We can also note some of the abstracted textures that we looked at earlier also as texturing within these. And again, these are largely set up as triplanar projections, so we'll take a look at one building and pick that apart. Okay, let's go ahead and pick a building here. And what we can do is isolate select this to avoid the rest of the buildings. Okay, so this is a design based on Frank Lloyd Wright's Mile High Tower. And what I can do here is just show the use of triplanar. So let's go ahead and pick this, and I'll go to IPR and create an IPR of this. I'll use render active as a way to speed up this process and only render the single building. And let's look at the shader that this was created from. Okay, this has a few attached to it, and in this case this is a base concrete, and the color is driven by the triplanar projection, and that's simply driven by that concrete map. Let's look at one of the reflective glass. It looks like banded. And this is a Phong shader to get a tighter highlight for the glass. The color map, again, triplanar. And a particular, looks like the banded glass texture map that we looked at earlier. And this has, what, about 5 stories tall on it or so. What we can do now is we can go to the texture placement icon itself and select it. And let's turn textures on here. Okay, so in this bit of a jumbled mess that we have, let's dolly out. And let me set up my views here quickly. All right, now I have the texture placement icons selected here, and my IPR put in the side view. And what I can do is scale these up or down to change the scaling on the building itself. And let's take it down much finer. Now the beauty about this, of course, is with triplanar mapping, it's going to turn the corner among this kind of randomly oriented geometry. And in each case, it will create a continuity of scale among that pattern or among that texture. So that's the beauty of triplanar. And again, I didn't have to work on this face by face. I was able to apply this to the entire building or portions of the building and have it map very accurately. So again, for just rough design studies and buildings, this is a great solution. If this was a very hero building with a lot of very specific details, we would certainly unwrap this properly and do a very elaborate texturing job. But for a large cityscape, triplanar has proved to be a great solution. All right, the other aspect we want to look at on this particular shader is that of the reflection map. And we can see it clearly in the icon, or in the shader ball rendition. But let's go, here we have the color map we've already looked at. We go down to reflected color, and that gets mapped into a spherical environment. That spherical environment is then fed by the 4K lat-long map that I've created in Photoshop. One thing, by the way, on that map is that the horizon line does need to be centered between the vertical extent of the map to be oriented properly. All right, so the important thing here is that that was mapped to, let's say if I was just to get to the texture creation menu. Under textures, what we want to do is choose under environment, choose environment sphere. And the reason this is important as opposed to actually placing a reflection map directly onto the object is that here we have an arbitrary abstracted sphere that represents the world environment which maps to it. So now as the camera moves about this object, we'll get proper reflection grazing across the building. And looking back now at the base shader, we also have a reflection map. And this is now fed by the mask file that was created of that texture map. So that restricts the reflectivity to just the windowed region. And it looks like there's also a spec map on here, triplanar again, and again the same thing to restrict the specularity again to the glass region as well. So there's a lot more you could do with this shader. The obvious thing would be to bump map out the deflection of the windows or the window seams, which I have not done. And you'll see on the final everything looks like a very continuous piece of glass. That'd be the obvious thing to do next. There could be more definition on the non-reflected areas, a lot of things. But the basic point here to get across is the use of the triplanar is a way to set the entire shader up. So let's go back and look at the final render now. So here's the final render of this particular building. And as we just talked about, we could add a bump here to add more displacement to the glass, just to show some erratic displacement as well as seam within the glass pieces. We could also add some Fresnel reflection behavior so that the steeper the angle the glass is seen, the more reflective it becomes. And that's done with the facing ratio utility node in Maya. So now looking at the full scene render, let's now apply this over the background plate and see where we stand. So clearly the first thing to do next would be to integrate the model into the landscape better. And the only easy way to do this, I think, initial way to do this would be to create a series of 2D cards placed out in front of samples of these trees to dovetail it into the treescape. I certainly don't want to get into any type of modeling of the treescape down here. We can see this has a lot of integration problems. But in general, the next title in this series will cover render by layer and compositing issues. So let's look at one final render of this with the card trees added, and this will conclude this title. Okay, now we have a render with a integration of trees, and we can see this along the kind of the base of the structure. And again, all this is very simple cards. Let's look at this in wireframe. And it's just a small collection of cards with opacity and with incandescence mapping of the tree forms themselves taken off of the plate. So we can see here's the just a little snippet from the plate and an opacity map. And these are mapped to a series of cards. So again, there's limitations here. The camera obviously could not, there's a danger of discovering that they are in fact just cards, but due to the nature of this camera move, I think it actually will be fine. The other thing that's important here is you want to make sure that within one of these cards, under render stats, you have cast shadows unchecked. We certainly don't want to have a shadow map cast of the card onto, let's see here, the base of the structure. Again, if we did, we'd risk, I think, discovery that they are cards, as well as using having a non-specular shading model. Just a surface shader is all that's required for this. Okay, so I think that's where we're going to leave it for this disk. The next disk will pick up from here and talk about rendering by layer. So now that we have the final render of this, we'll talk about how to strategize to break it up for a professional composite. And we'll also look at a little bit of effects animation that can help richen up the final shot as well. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.